Hello and welcome back to another edition of Introduction to Windows Server 2012 and 2016 Administration. My name is Scott Neal. Today we are going to be focusing on user accounts, and today's short lecture will be covering Exam Objective 5.2 if you're looking to take the 70-410 Microsoft Certification Exam. And we're going to be really talking about users and computers today, which is Chapter 14 if you're following along in the book. We're going to be looking at the differences between local and domain user accounts, as well as creating and managing domain user objects, as well as domain computer objects today. And I want to go ahead and get started by talking to you about local users versus domain users. So, most people are probably aware by now that there are two different worlds in which computers live in general. There is the world of the local system. The local system is your computer, my computer at home. Computers that are not on the domain, they live within their own world, and they have their own accounts for users on the box. So local user accounts are accounts that can only access the resources on the local computer and are stored in the local security account manager, or SAM database, on the system where they reside. They cannot be used really to authenticate to other resources, and back in when we did work groups as a way of communicating from system to system, it was important to recognize that every system that we communicated with on that network was its own peer. So everybody had to have an account on each box that represented or gave them authentication and authorization to use each of those boxes on the network. It's one of the big reasons why domains came into existence. Because with domains, now we have accounts that can readily access the Active Directory database or network-based resources, and it did this by storing that database on a domain controller in a centralized database. We've talked about domain controllers earlier in this lecture series. So domain users really allowed us to authenticate to other resources doing, the single sign-on kind of thing, if you want to say it that way, where we don't have to worry about multiple accounts on the domain. We can use our same account to authenticate to multiple resources on the same network. So that's the power of domain users. For most of our users, if we're IT administrators, we're just going to give them a domain user account. We're not going to give them local user accounts on their own machines. There may be some exceptions. If you have a user that's going to, Tibet or something, and they need a laptop, we may set up a local user account on that laptop simply because there's no guarantee they'll have any connectivity to our network resources, and they may still need to use the laptop. So, but for most of our users, they do not understand that the world is different, that there's a local world in which the box resides, and then there's the domain world, which most of us live in at the corporate level. We are, for the most part, using domain user accounts. We may use a local user account as an IT admin to authenticate to maybe a local administrator account as a backdoor way in to effect repairs onto a system that cannot connect to the domain. But for the most part, IT admins, regular users, we all use domain user accounts. So let's take a quick look at the differences between both of these accounts. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that we have an example of a domain user account. And we actually went into the local users and groups for this Windows 10 professional machine that you see here on the left. And you can see we have some built-in accounts like the administrator account and the guest account. And then we have one or two user accounts, namely my account for using the box. You'll also notice if I look at my account, I really have very little to choose from in way of how I can manage that account. The General tab gives me some cursory options as far as whether or not I need to change my password for a password policy, whether or not the account's disabled, and so on. I can add groups to this account or remove groups from this account. And I do have the ability to go in and set up some profile descriptionary settings. If you look on the right-hand side, though, you'll notice that there are many tabs associated with the domain user account. There's not only the member of a group tab, but there's all sorts of tabs that give access to things like remote resources, dial-in resources, The environment, it allows me to go in and actually set up times in which the user can or cannot access the network. So I really can micromanage this account through the properties screen for the user account in the domain. So there are some significant advantages to using domain user accounts over local user accounts when given the opportunity to do so. There are some built-in user accounts associated with domains and with local machines. The two predominant accounts that you'll see in both instances is, of course, the administrator account and the guest account. So on a member server or a standalone server, the built-in local administrator account has full control of all the files as well as complete management permissions for the local computer. On the domain controller, however, the built-in administrator account becomes the domain admin once you have promoted that box to a domain controller. And then that domain admin, which is created in Active Directory, will have full control of the domain for which it was created. The administrator account, of course, cannot be deleted. It can be and should be renamed as a matter of security preferences. There are some guidelines when it comes to using administrator accounts. Of course, whenever possible, we want to rename that account, whether it's a domain account or a local account. And the reason for that is that more often than not, if someone is going to try to brute force or try to break into your machine, they're going to try to use the administrator account as the means to do that. Why? Well, of course, if you're going to be breaking into the machine, wouldn't you want to break in with the account with the most privileges? So they're going to use a set of rainbow tables with all these common passwords, and the very first account that's going to be in that rainbow table, of course, is administrator. Now, if you've changed that name to something else, that's going to make it just so much more difficult for whoever's breaking into the system to try to guess what that account name is, let alone what the password is. Speaking of passwords, we really want to put a strong password on this account. The length of the password is going to be the most important quality when it comes to setting a password. Bear in mind, of course, that in Windows 10 boxes, Windows 8.1 boxes, Windows 8 boxes, the administrator account is disabled by default. This is done on purpose. When you create your account when you build that box, that account does have administrator privileges, but the account itself for the administrator has been disabled. This is a new feature since Windows 8 came around, and if you're using Windows XP or anything below that, we never question whether or not the administrator account was enabled or disabled. With that said, more often than not, if you're working in an IT environment with multiple users and multiple systems, you may want to enable this account as a means of being able to effect repairs to the system. And if you're going to do that, then you really should change your name and put a very, very long password on it. Also, I'm going to want to limit the knowledge of who can have access to the administrator account, whether that's the local administrator account to the boxes on your network or the domain admin account itself. Only a few people need to have these keys to the kingdom. So 1 or 2 people may be domain administrators, while the rest of your IT staff is using the premise of least privilege, and their administrative account is going to have only the properties needed for them to perform the duties of the day. The domain admin account, of course, should also be put in a safe somewhere, locked up. You never know when that domain admin may disappear or get run over, and you really need to have a way to be able to recover that account. Do not use the administrator account for daily non-administrative tasks. The domain admin account, if you touch a system that is infected, or you are surfing the internet and you come across some particularly nasty malware, there is a possibility, since you're running in elevated privileges, that you're just going to make it so much easier for that malware to introduce itself onto your network and spread throughout the network quickly. So IT admins should always have 2 accounts. They should always have a standard user account and an administrator account with the privileges needed for them to do their job. The standard user account is not only for their day-to-day activities like surfing the internet, looking for another job, but they're also going to be using that account for troubleshooting. So if they are always using an account with administrative privileges and they're trying to troubleshoot an issue that is associated with another user, then they are going to be at a disadvantage because they're not going to be able to see what the user sees when they log in. And if they have a standard user account, then that's just another way of determining whether or not the issue is part of their profile only or whether it affects all standard users. So it's standard practice that all IT admins have both a standard user account and the administrator account for their job. The guest account, of course, is another built-in account associated with both local machines and with domain controllers. The built-in account is used to provide temporary access to the network for users such as a vendor, any other representative, an auditor, or maybe even a temporary employee. Generally speaking, in most environments I know, we keep this disabled. It is disabled out of the box. If you purchase Windows 10 today, that account is disabled. If you are using a domain controller, the best thing to do for your domain is keep the guest account disabled. We oftentimes just create accounts that are going to meet the specific needs of these people that are going to be coming in, whether they're temporary, like auditors or whatever. We just find it easier to go ahead and create an account for them, set it up specifically for that purpose, instead of taking the risk of enabling the guest account. The guest account can't be deleted either. It should be renamed, and as I said before, it is disabled by default, and it is not assigned a default password. There are some creation tools in addition to being able to go in through the GUI interface, and I have a video for that as well, showing you how to create users and computers on the network. But there are some user creation tools that can be used at the command line, either through the command line utility or the Windows PowerShell. One of those tools, probably the most common tools used, is the dsadd command. It is the standard command line tool for creating Active Directory leaf objects, and I can use that tool with batch files to create Active Directory objects in bulk. Really cool. There's a video for you to watch that demonstrates this very easily. Comma separated value directory exchange, or CSVDE-EXE. This is really a command line utility that we use to create Active Directory objects by importing data through comma separated value files, or CSV files. So dsadd, I can use a text file very similarly to what I could do with CSVDE. So more often than not, you'll see me use dsadd with a text file with many users associated with it, and it works just as well as using the CSVDE tool. It really just depends on what you're going to be importing or what you're going to be exporting that data out as. Either you're going to be exporting it out as a text file or a comma delimited file. Either way, these tools work brilliantly. There's also the LDAP, Data Interchange Format Directory Exchange, also known as LDIFDE. It works very similarly to the comma separated value directory exchange. It has the ability to import Active Directory information and use it to add, delete, modify objects in addition to modifying the schema itself if necessary. So let's look at, if you look at some of the syntax associated with using dsadd, and we can use dsadd for the command prompt, and you can see that there are many different syntaxes associated with it. So I have the ability either through the dsadd or through the comma delimited tool to really create accounts and set those accounts up specifically the way I want them, using an import. So if I have a database created by HR, and every night I ask for that database to dump a text file or a comma delimited file into a share drive folder, I can then have a tool run automatically at night using either a batch file or using a command line or a script which will then pull that file and pull the data from it and then import these users into the system. Takes a lot of manual labor off of the IT admin if you do it this way. But you can see just by, I'm not going to go through this whole screen here, but I can really set up, and even though more often than not I'm just interested in the basics for my users, their account name, their first name, last name, account name, description, whether I want the account disabled, because by default it's disabled, so turn that on so it's enabled, and so on, set a password. But I can also go in and set up any comment in those user profiles. I can set up or fill that schema using DSAdd. So it's a very powerful utility when it comes to adding computers and users. All right. In addition to being able to set up computers and users that way, I also have the ability to create templates. A user template is really just a standard user object containing all of the common attribute settings for a particular group of users that I may be creating pretty regularly. So with a template, in order to create a new user, I can just simply find the template, copy the template to a new user object, and then change the name on it. And there you go. With a couple small tweaks, I will then have my new user up and running. I can change any of the attributes that are different in the template. The template really just gives me a starting point for some of my more common users that I know that I will be setting up on a day-to-day basis. Computer objects work very similarly to user objects. They consist of properties that specify the computer's name, where it's located, who can manage it. And they do inherit group policy settings from the container objects such as domain sites and organizational units. And of course, computers can be members of groups just like users and inherit permissions from group objects. So as far as adding computers to a domain, I have to create a computer account. And creating a computer account can be done one of two ways. I can either go ahead in advance and set up computer accounts in the Active Directory and assign the name of the actual computer for the network. There are options that will allow me to set that up, and if computers try to connect to the network that are not in the Active Directory, they will fail to be added to the domain. The other option, of course, and probably the more common option, is to simply just allow computers to be added to the domain from the computers themselves. So I can join the computer to the domain by sitting at that client workstation or that server. The system contacts the domain controller, establishes that trust relationship with the domain. The user at the console has to authenticate to the domain using credentials that will allow computers to be added to the domain. Locates or creates a computer object corresponding to the computer's name. It will alter the security identifier, also known as a SID, to match that of the computer object, and then it will modify the group memberships as you've got it set up to do. So, as I said before, if I say here that this is an example of setting up a computer through the Active Directory interface, where I can create the computer objects in advance using the Active Directory tool, so that the computers can locate the existing objects when they join the domain. Or, like I said before, begin the joining process first, let the computer create its own computer object in the Active Directory, and then go back later and manage that computer through Active Directory interfaces. If I want to create a computer through the Active Directory Administrator Center, I have that option too. I can do that with both users and computers. The Active Directory Administrative Center is a tool that has been around now since Server 2008. That allows you to go in through the server console and the server manager console and actually manage Active Directory settings. I'm an old school kind of guy. I prefer to go into the Active Directory tools themselves and make these changes, but more and more administrators are getting used to and comfortable with the Administrative Center for making these changes. There's also the ability to create computer objects using the DSAdd command. What you see here, DSAdd computer, and then have the computer's DN structure associated with it. That parameter is going to specify the distinguished name for the new group object you want to create. So I can use the DSAdd command just like I can for creating new users to add new computers to the network. Bear in mind, of course, that computers must be joined to the domain in order to be trusted and interact with other domain resources. Client systems can be added through the system menu. Server systems, of course, can be added simply by clicking on the computer or the domain name under the server manager. IT specialists usually have added permissions, which are going to allow us to join multiple systems to the domain. Domain admins have this privilege as well. And domain users can also create computer objects themselves through an indirect process. A lot of people don't realize that domain users by default do have the ability to add computer objects to the domain by default. So it is an indirect process, but it is something you should be aware of as an IT admin. It is a disableable feature in Active Directory. The default domain controls policy grants a user right called add workstations to the domain to any authenticated user's special identity. And that includes all your domain users. So this is, like I said, it's not something that a lot of IT admins are aware of, but it is something you should be, because it's probably not advisable to have your users going in and setting up workstations on the domain without your knowledge. Any user successfully authenticated to the Active Directory is permitted to join up to 10 workstations to the domain and can create 10 associated computer objects. You can opt to dispense with the GUI interface and add the system to the domain locally or remotely through the command line using the netdom.exe command. What you see here is the syntax for it. So you have to know the computer name, you have to know the domain name, you have to also be able to have privileges to do so, so your user account and your user password, and you also have the option to add it to any organizational unit in the Active Directory structure. So you can do it this way as well if you happen to know all that information. Maybe you're sitting at someone else's console. This will give you the ability to quickly and easily add a system. I also have the ability to join computers to the domain while they're offline. This is a two-part process using the djoin.exe program. So on the computer with access to the domain controller, I would simply go in and set up, type in djoin and type the command to activate that system, and then it's going to generate a file called whatever you call the file, .text, and then that text file is then imported onto the computer to be joined, and then I will run the djoin.exe command again on that system, and that will complete phase 2 of the process. This is a two-part process. More often than not, this is not a very convenient way to add a system to the domain. Maybe if you've got a remote user somewhere that needs to have a system added to the domain, this is one way that you can accomplish that. Another thing that we have the ability to do is disable accounts. Disabling a user account prevents, of course, the user from logging onto the domain until an administrator enables it again. And you can disable these accounts manually, or if you set up an expiration date on the account, it will, once it expires, it will disable by default. There are also some security rationale where the account may disable automatically if it matches certain criteria. It really is a simple and disable enable option in the GUI interface, as you can see here. If I want to, of course, disable or enable a user or computer account with the Windows PowerShell, I can do that with a commandlet called the disable or enable commandlet. And I can do that simply by going in and saying, for instance, I want to disable a user account. If I look at my example at the bottom of the screen, very simple command, disable ADA account, identity, and then of course the actual account name of the account that I want disabled. Alright, pretty simple lecture. So let's summarize. User account is the primary means by which people using Active Directory domain services getting access to network resources. One of the most common tasks for administrators is the creation of Active Directory users and computer objects. Windows Server 2012 and 2016 include a lot of different tools that we can use to create these objects. Those tools range from the GUI interface itself, using DSAD, NetDOM, etc. The Active Directory Administrative Center is the newfangled way of being able to manage both user and computer accounts, as well as many other things that we can do in Active Directory. Then of course there's the old school method of actually going in through the users and computers, MMC snap-in for Active Directory, and managing it that way. You can export user account information from several different applications. For instance, if I'm going to be setting up my HR department using or entering new users through an Excel spreadsheet, I can get them to export that Excel spreadsheet on a nightly basis, either as a text file or a comma separated values CSV format file, and then I can import that contents of that file directly into the Active Directory database using either an import script or the DSAD command, among a few other options. So, pretty quick lecture today talking about user groups, and I look forward to seeing you for our next lesson.